Welcome, Yogesh, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm delighted to have you as my guest today. We had a brilliant conversation. It was definitely, I think, in 2021. I won't say it was a year ago, but it could be close to a year ago that we had our initial conversation. And we just had so much in common. And, this podcast episode recording has definitely been a long time coming. So, for the sake of listeners, would you like to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Aoife. I'm thrilled to be on your show. And like you mentioned, I think we connected about a year ago. And at the time, I reached out to you to get your perspective on what makes people happy at work, right? I had just barely started writing the book. And then we have had these conversations over 1 year period and on and off. And you were one of the early supporters of the book. You
Thank
were
you.
one of the
Thanks.
beta readers. You read the
Yes.
book. You provided feedback. So you have seen the entire thing, right? When the book was barely a paragraphs to now
Yeah.
it's a
Yes.
printed, published book,
This
right?
is it. This is it.
This is this is amazing. This is amazing. I've been waiting to be on your podcast for a year now. I'm so very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me here. About myself, I introduce myself as a techie entrepreneur and a book author. I I techie first because for the first 18 years of my life, I have been working in the tech industry, first as a software engineer, then as a product manager. I currently live in Silicon Valley in California. Before that, I have lived in Europe for a while, actually 8 years in Switzerland.
Okay. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
happens to be my favorite place in the entire world. My son was born in Switzerland, so it's one of my favorite places to be there. I might sometime like go back there. But I was raised in India for the first 20 years of my life. I was in India. I got my technical degrees in India. Decided that I was too young to be working. Actually got a job in India, and then decided I was like a little bit bored. I always wanted to see Europe. Felt a strong connection to Europe. The first country I visited was Germany for 3 months during my college days, and I was like, man, I have to see and live in Europe to really absorb the culture there.
Yeah.
So that's why I moved to Switzerland. I am so glad that I did. For anyone who would read, potential readers of my book, they will find stories, very fond stories from Switzerland as well, and you will clearly see how my thought process and my own opinions about how the workplace should be is clearly derived from my experience in Switzerland. Then for the past 9 years, I have been in Silicon Valley. This is what they call a mecca of anything that is technology. Since I was
Yeah.
in a technology worker, naturally, Silicon Valley, attracted me quite a bit, mainly for work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was happy working, trying to get to a executive role, hopefully someday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and but then COVID happened,
Mm.
and COVID has affected so many people, millions of people in many different ways, right? I think one thing that also coincided with me is like, the midlife crisis, they call it, like when you try to hit around like 40 years of age.
Yeah.
That's what it happens. I thought it would never happen to me because I consider myself young at heart always.
Yeah.
But it did happen. I don't know whether it is because of COVID or because of my age or both, sort of mixed up. And then I was trying to figure out, okay, I love working, I love building technology products, but there is something missing. I'm
Mm.
not really enjoying what I'm doing. And I've had successful career so far. Things are looking good for the future as well, but I'm still not getting it right. And then I was like going all philosophical that you'll all have one life to live. I'm coming from like a Hindu culture, but I don't actually believe in multiple lives. So I thought, half of my life is gone, and what's making me happy at this place, right?
Yeah.
And then I realized I actually don't know.
Mm.
What does a happy workplace look like?
Yeah.
I spoke to other people, and they were unhappy, and they were like also like going through the motions to the weekend, living for the weekend, and things like that. And whenever you ask someone, "How are you?" they're like, "I'm fine," but "I'm fine" really means that there's something going on, right? It doesn't really mean that you're actually fine. So for my next job, I was thinking, okay, what kind of company would I like to work in? What will make me happy? I did not have this answer to the question, right? So let alone finding this company, my next job, I did not even know what the next job looks like, right? So I
Yeah.
had to ask these questions, dig deeper. And surprisingly, it was very, very hard for me. That maybe due to my own lack of self-awareness or general lack of awareness of what's out there for whatever reason, right? I couldn't figure it out for myself. So I had to inspect, and I started researching on this. What makes people happy? What would make me happy at work? And it turned out during my research, I was reaching out to lots of people on LinkedIn. That's when I reached out to you as well.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, I met Professor Eric Koester, who teaches book writing at Georgetown University in Washington. And it turned out that he was accepting the cohort of people who are not enrolled at the university to teach book writing. He's like, why did you write a book? I'm like, I have written like 3 blogs in my log. What do you mean? And then he told me that only 1% or 2% people who start writing a book actually finish writing it. I'm like, thank you very much. That sounds extremely optimistic.
Yeah. So the
You know
failure
what?
rate is high.
Yeah, failure rate is super high. And then I said, okay, yeah, sounds good. Whatever, let's just jump through it, right? Jump through a cliff. We'll figure out the rest later.
Yeah.
And I was so glad that I actually accepted this offer, because it introduced me to the concept of community-based writing. They like to call it never write alone, meaning there's a lot of other authors who are helping each other out, introducing to their network. There are author coaches and editors and all those things, right? So you don't have to do it alone. And I'm so glad that I went through this guided process, and I can just focus on figuring out what's the useful thing, like writing the useful thing or writing a useful book. That was my focus, and rest everything about publishing the book, editing the book was taken care about by the publishers and by the community. I'm so glad.
Yeah. You didn't have to worry about that secondary stuff.
Exactly.
Brilliant. There's actually loads to unpack in what you said there, Yogesh. And like for me, you know what you're talking about, I can so relate, and I think a lot of listeners will be able to relate to that you get to a certain age and that makes you sort of question everything. But coupled with the fact that we had COVID, and for a lot of the last couple of years we have been working from home, we've been working remotely, we've been living kind of, you know, in close quarters with those that we live with, or else feeling very isolated because we live alone. You know, I live alone, so a lot of that 2 years was quite an isolating time for me. Thankfully, I've got family close by, which is great. But I think a lot of people called into question their purpose at work and whether or not they're happy doing what they're continuing to do. So thank you for highlighting that, first of all. A slight side note, given that you live in Silicon Valley, is I've watched all of the series Silicon Valley, which is kind of it's a bit of a cult show, but it's a bit of an eye opener as to what goes on, and I'm curious to know whether it's reflective of reality, let's say.
Yeah, I think in parts definitely yes. So they exaggerate a bit to make it funny, for sure.
Oh, of course,
yeah, make it some caricatures and all those things, but you know, it does happen, right? A lot of times in the big VCs, you know, people like to believe that big VCs have it all figured out, right? And they are investing in these companies, right? But if you think about it, a failure rate of the companies that the VCs invest in, for example, is super high, right?
Yeah.
It's only because they can only take educated guess and all those things, right? So a lot of time, you can read through some articles how certain VCs paused on investing on certain companies that eventually became, you know, decacorns, but unicorns, decacorns, or whatever the term, right? Like huge companies. On the other hand, you can also hear stories about, you know, I think there was this company that was internet connected juicer or something like that.
Okay.
And there was like $120 million investment in internet connected juicer. And they had this juicer thingy, you know, like you have coffee tablets that goes in Nespresso, right? So they had something like a juicer tablet that would go onto, right? And people
like
soon
Internet
figured
of Things, essentially, is it?
Essentially, yes, yeah. And they had this this sachet of pulp or juice
Mm.
that was supposed to go into the IoT connected machine, the
Yeah.
juicer, right? But people very soon figured out that if you just squeeze through the sachet, just pour out the juice like that, and you don't actually need the machine. so,
Okay.
so
Uh-oh.
soon after,
Yeah.
soon after,
120 million. Yeah.
yeah, it's gone,
Yeah.
right? So that's funny, right? And as you can see, it's not very far from the reality that show, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Absolutely. And I suppose, I mean, this is the billion-dollar question, but like, what were the conclusions? So you started this book because you didn't feel that happy in work. You reached out to colleagues, realized there's a lot of people who actually feel the same way. And I was the same, a few years ago, where you get to a certain stage in your career. I had had a really enjoyable career up to that point. I had worked in places that I really, I really, really was able to thrive. Um, but in the process of writing the book, in reaching out and connecting with all these people, in doing this research, what is the kind of the main conclusion that you found?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I'll take a little bit long-winded road to answer this
Yeah,
question.
absolutely. And I just wanted to point out, sorry, the name of the book is Digital Belonging. So, I mean, for me, like it's a really, I think it captures what the book is all about. But I'll let you go on and kind of explain what you found
Sure, sure,
during this process.
sure. So you mentioned the title of the book, Digital Belonging. It's about building human-centered organizations. And when I say human, I'm referring to the employees and treating them as human, not human resources. And essentially what I was trying to do was my skill set as a product manager taught me to whatever product we are building, you focus first on the users or the customers. So I asked this question, what if the company was the product and the employees were the users? How would that company look like? Right. So rather than focusing on the shareholder or the external customers, um, also focus on the employees, right? I would not say exclude the shareholders or exclude the customers, but also include the employees as one of the major stakeholders
Mm.
around which you would design the company. So that was a question. And you referred to the isolation during COVID times, right?
Mm.
So it was very easy for people to blame everything blanket on COVID. And everyone is working remotely. You know what? It doesn't work. We are not able to build culture, things like that. Let's bring everyone back. Right? But that's like very, very surface level conclusion, devoid of any scientific facts or understanding, right? But isolation is really the key. And during my research, I figured that indeed isolation is very injurious to human health. But unlike what majority of people think, isolation is not the outcome of the COVID. Yes, people were isolated during COVID times. Yes, but and this is the statistics from there's a company called Cigna. It's a big medical company in the US,
Mm-hmm.
and they conducted a survey. This was before the COVID hit. Around 61% of American workforce were lonely at work. 61%,
Okay. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Before the pandemic, when everyone was like in the office and things were supposed to be hunky dory, and that's a huge number, right? It's not like 18%, 10%,
Mm.
2%. It's 61%.
Yeah.
And then CDC, which is the Medical Association of the US, uh, they, according to them, workplace stress is the fifth largest cause of death in the US,
Mm.
and that's above diabetes in US. And you can imagine diabetes is such a big thing in US, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So clearly we have been doing things wrong way before the pandemic, and pandemic just highlighted, right? I call it as a pandemic as the low tide event where there's a lot of stuff hiding under the high tide, and when the water retreats,
Yeah.
then you can see the
It all
patterns of
comes
what's
to the
going on, right?
surface. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So it
Yeah.
was hidden under the fancy offices and
Mm.
free food and laundry at side and call you out, right? But
Yeah.
the things were not well even before that, right? And now you mentioned about isolation, and I think it's a very well-known fact that humans have been living in tribes for very, very long.
Mm.
I think just 10,000 years ago, probably before we were farming. I think 10 or 20,000 years ago, we were just living in tribes and not living in the tribe, or if someone was excluded or ostracized from the tribe, they would die, right? And we have evolved to have very serious negative repercussions mentally, psychologically, if we are excluded or isolated from the group. So finding tribes, and I don't want to use the word tribe here, because I've been working in some companies where there would be 2 or 3 tribes forming, and then there will be a tribal war within within the
So it's kind
organization.
of, it gets a bit clicky, is that it?
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
And
that's why I did not.
competitive.
Yeah, super competitive, right? And there was also this concept of team, where I've been in situations where I have been part of the team, but everyone is like taking shots at me. I call it in the book as if living in the war zone, where the next sniper bullet would take me out, right? I have been in that situation. I've been part of so-called teams where my own team members would not share information with me, and I would have to go to our customers to get some documentation from that was supposed to be shared with me. Things like that, right?
Can we just kind of pause there for a second and say, like, what was the reason for that? Was that the culture that the company had created, that the leadership had created within that organization, that like knowledge sharing is bad, and like such a competitive culture that it's in my own personal interest to trip someone else up at work so that I can succeed, so that I can get a promotion, so that I can get more money? Like, is that the mentality that was created, or what was the cause of that?
So it's very, very hard to figure out the exact cause of when did it start and things like that, right? Because the people who have started this culture maybe they're long gone, and the culture remains, right? Culture lives on for thousands of years, actually, right? But I think you're pointing to something that I do mention, is about the individualistic culture. If you look very carefully about what do we incentivize in all companies, or majority of 99% of companies, this is concept of performance appraisal, or incentives, performance bonuses, stock options, RSUs, bonuses, promotions, etc. Right? So everything is individual, and this gives rise to this competition. I used to work in a team. It was like one of the best software teams, mainly because of my manager. He had built an all-star team, right? Everybody used to talk about all-star team, and he had actually succeeded in building this all-star team. And then come performance appraisal, he was told that, look, we have this limited budget for bonus, so you have to do this bell curve, where some people would be higher than average.
I'm very familiar with the bell curve. Yes.
Yeah, bell curve, right? And the guy was like, it makes no sense. Didn't you like ask me to build an all-star team? And they are all-star. Like, they're literally the best software engineers that you can find anywhere on the planet, right? And then they're asking me to give like lower performance numbers, right? I mean, you cannot even measure performance. Yeah, you cannot even measure the performance objectively, or the value that every person has been driving. It's very, very hard to measure this objectively, right? So it made no sense. And then obviously when you have this bell curve, everybody wants to be on the right side of the bell curve. So then there is like internal competition, right? And then the collaboration and cooperation goes out of the window. And by the way, it has been shown many over times that people are generally cooperative, but it's the incentives that turn them, and they provide the wrong kind of incentives, would almost force their hand to behave otherwise contrary to their human nature, right? And I just ask this question: if we are a company, we are supposed to come together to solve this bigger problem that none of us can solve alone, right? If that is the case, why is not everyone aligned, right? So why is there, for example, no culture of team performance? I've never heard any team performance appraisals, or there are certain outcomes or metrics, sometimes like that. But again, the performance appraisals is individual, right? So it's very, very hard. And this performance appraisal is done by your manager, whose hand is tied because of this bell curve and this kind of things, right?
Yeah.
So I think the incentive, the organization structure, and the incentive itself probably have to evolve quite a bit to tell people that, look, we build, we solve bigger problems in teams here, and a team itself is fully autonomous to take decisions, and we can fix the outcomes for the team. You say you drive this outcome, but then a team should be fully autonomous to organize themselves whatever way they see best fit, and the team should be capable or autonomous in terms of deciding managing the performance of the team, right? You don't need an external person or an SVP to manage the performance of an individual, right? The team should be able to take care of this amongst themselves, right? Sometimes a team member is having some personal issues or whatever, then maybe other team member can pick up some slack.
And in the knowledge that that other person would do exactly the same for them as well. So it's kind of almost a combination of not autonomy, but accountability. The accountability, so we're accountable to each other, and because we're in this team and we're being appraised as a team, we're going to support each other and to get the job done at all costs. And this is kind of also with the awareness that we're not creating subcultures within this where we're competing against other teams, that we're all here as a unit to try and exactly as you say, serve this higher purpose, solve this bigger problem.
Absolutely. And since the word team, team itself has been, I would say, rather misused.
Okay.
And or used very casually, where we say, okay, this is part of the team, but none of the team members are remotely, connected at an emotional level to each other, or they are even working on goals that are completely opposing or competing, right? So that's why I didn't want to use the word team. So that's why in the book I use the word community.
Okay.
And this community would be say larger than the team, in the sense that members of the community, by definition, they are interested in the success of the community as well as their own success, right? So the community is responsible for individual success, and individual is responsible for the community's success. And by definition, community members have a common purpose, and they have a shared values. Their behaviors are also shared, and they don't go outside of the norm of the community. And people find meaning and belonging in community, right? So that's the key. There was this McKinsey report. It was conducted over, I think, 10,000 employees globally, where they showed that the number one reason why employees are leaving their work or resigning from their jobs, well-paying jobs, I might add, is because they lack a sense of belonging. And if there is no community, the concept of community at work, they don't have a community to belong to, right? So how would they feel this sense of belonging? So that is the key message of the book, where you can reimagine the organization as a big community or a bunch of smaller micro communities, because the smaller communities are much easier to maintain. But the company itself is a bigger community, and that company includes the employees, but also the customers. I think there's a very good example of this company called GitLab, which is an all remote company.
Remote,
you know this company, right?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Since 2014, right? And they are super successful since, I think they went IPO in 2020, and they are $10 billion company.
Okay.
And clearly something went right for them.
Yeah.
And I saw a talk from their CEO, Sid, and he drew a picture diagram where he calls their employees, I think are some members, I forget the exact name, but he clearly shows in that diagram that the community is made up of the customers, some solution providers, suppliers even, and then the company members or the employees, right? So so this sense of belonging was built by design in GitLab, and that's why they were so successful, right? And they have been doing it since last 8 years, I would say. They are present in 65 different countries. 1,200 different employees, and they were able to do it. And clearly, the lack of office did not deter them from achieving success. Right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is
So
doable.
it's not about having the office. I think we all learned that from COVID. I was at an event last night, and they were talking about like the numbers of people who are back in the office and the different numbers of days that they're back. So like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or fully remote, or fully in the office or fully remote, or something in between. And it was interesting. The results, very kind of mixed results within the within the room that was there. But I think, Yogesh, you're sort of speaking my language now in relation to the this idea of belonging and the behaviors and the values within a team. And I suppose, and maybe you didn't get to this in the book, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are from the research that you've done, from the experiences that you've had, is how do you form a team like that to begin with? So if we're saying what's wrong is the teams are disconnected, they don't have shared goals, their behaviors are not reflective of what the community wants. And interesting use of that word community, because in one of the past episodes with Ted Rubin, he uses exactly that language to describe what we're really doing at work. Is we have this community, and putting this focus on employees, I think, is so important. So any thoughts on how do you create a culture like that? How do you create a community with, that community being the organization, and how do you create those sub communities where people have these, not just the shared goals, because I think that's probably fairly straightforward, but the shared norms, the shared behaviors, the shared values. How do you go about actually creating that?
I think that's a good question. We first begin with figuring out what are the basic human needs. And
Yeah.
I captured that in an acronym, digital. So digital is was a little bit of a wordplay. Digital stands for dignity, inclusion, growth, independence, trust, appreciation, and love. So obviously there are different other human needs, but I sort of thought that it would be easy if I capture that in a nice to remember acronym. So we first begin with these needs,
Mm.
and and everybody has to understand that, for example, sense of dignity, right?
Yeah.
It's a basic human requirement. If you disrespect someone else, if you
Mm.
take away their dignity, uh, they are humiliated. Humiliation leads to violence. There is no doubt about that,
Yeah.
right? So it's a very basic concept, but it is missed by so many people, right? So all the norms, values, and behaviors come out from the human need, right?
Mm.
So it's not enough to simply say, okay, we talk to each other too nicely, right? But it's important to understand that we're talking about really not taking away dignity of another person, and that could be, by questioning their attire or questioning their, you know right to practice religious
Yeah.
beliefs or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it also much more than that, right? When you micromanage someone, you're taking
Yeah.
away their dignity as well, right? You're
Mm.
not trusting them. Lack of trust in someone is also like taking away their dignity, right? So I unpack this acronym in the book, but from these needs, these values, come different norms and behaviors.
Mm.
And now, once that is understood, then in the book I mentioned there's this strategic framework to create belonging. I call it TACT. So transparency, autonomy, community, and technology. These are the four pillars that is used to create belonging, right? And transparency is not just, okay, let's just put everything in a Google Drive and be done with it kind of thing, right? So transparency is extremely important, first of all, to create belonging, because this opacity uh, and uncertainty
Mm.
creates fear in people.
It
And
creates
when,
us and them cultures, doesn't it? It's like,
yeah,
and I remember being on both sides, being the one who's, let's for want of a better word, be outside the room where managers are having that discussion, and you're like, I'm not really sure what's being talked about in there, what's going on, and then you don't get an update about what the meeting was about, or there's no kind of communication afterwards. And I've also been on the other side where we're discussing people very openly in a room, and yet they didn't know that this was how and this is going back to this performance appraisals, they had no idea that this is how the performance appraisals are being done. From my perspective, it creates a very us and them type of culture, this lack of transparency.
Absolutely. And now you mentioned that you were sometimes outside of the room.
Mm.
And now in this the new world, in the remote world, everyone is outside the room at
Yeah,
all times,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
So just you can just imagine if you are in this state of fear because you don't know what's coming, because some people are talking behind your back, and if you're in the state of fight or flight all the time, then it's number one, super difficult to form meaningful trusting relationship with your
yeah,
coworkers.
yeah.
And number two is it actually hinders your creative brain or your creativity,
Mm.
which is why, at least in the knowledge economy or the tech sector, this is why people were hired to, to do
Yeah,
creative
yeah.
work,
Yeah,
right?
to use their intellect, to use their brains. It's not our hands that people want anymore. It's our
Right,
brains, and
right,
then
right.
to a degree as well, our hearts to be emotionally connected with the place
Yeah.
where we work.
And just think about it, right? A new software engineer joins a company and they don't know, okay, if I work hard, do I get promoted? How do I get promoted? What does the
Yeah,
promotion mean in here,
yeah,
right? What are the right projects? Sometimes the strategic priority of the team or company is not clear. Sometimes the CEO would send out an email and say, here is what we're going to do, but there's no information about, okay, how did we come to this conclusion? Why are we doing this? Why are we
yeah,
not doing something else? What was the rationale behind the decision? Nothing, nip, zada. So I think transparency is important in so many different ways. First of all,
yeah.
which sets the foundation of putting
Of
everyone on
everything
the
else.
same
Yeah,
page and
yeah,
calming the people down
yeah.
first,
There's
right?
I mean, something else occurred to me as well. It's not just about transparency in that kind of direct context. It's the having really clear expectations. So being really transparent about, like, what is my expectation of you as an employee. Transparency around the roles and responsibilities of and there's so many people who they just don't know. They might have got a promotion, they were hired based on a job description, but or based on a job ad, but they've never seen a job description, or it's not. There's like other inherent things that are not really clear when you first join an organization, of the expectations that are placed on you that go beyond what's actually described in the role that you have. So I think as leaders, as people managers, it's so important to be really clear about the expectations that you have of people. Because, I mean, I've been in team meetings where, and this is a mistake I've made in the past, where someone suggested something like, oh, I think we should, and I can't remember the exact thing, but I recalled that it was like, I'm thinking to myself, that's what you should be doing anyway. That's in your job description. That's, if you're making this as a suggestion, as a way to improve the team, like, you should actually have already been doing this.
Mm.
And I'm thinking to myself, why weren't you doing this already? So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, you're absolutely right about this roles and responsibility, right? Because I think about it, if you want to feel a part of the community or the tribe, you can just imagine just hypothetical thought experiment where you were living in a tribe that used to hunt for living, for example, right?
Mm,
I think some people were good at making the arrows, and I'm making this up, I don't know, right? Some other people were good at rather shooting
yeah.
the animals, all right? Some other people were good at skinning or cutting them, right? So it's
Mm,
just a mass cooperation, right?
yeah, yeah.
And everybody had their roles and responsibilities, I think, super clear back then, I would imagine, right? But because there were small tribes, and uh, I would argue, okay, sometimes there's mass cooperation when there are like 50,000 employees in a company.
Mm,
It's gigantic, right? So uh, mass cooperation at this level, even we are able to do this, something like this, is really a miracle, right? And it's all kudos to human ingenuity and our ability to tell stories that bind us towards certain goals, right? You mentioned earlier that shared goals is setting that is easy, but in
I
practice,
didn't I didn't mean to say it was easy, but it's more practical. It's more
yeah,
practical than, trying to define what the values are. I know that, yeah, defining the shared goals is not, it's not straightforward, but it's more of a practical approach. Whereas I think, um, when you're talking about things like behavior and values, it's less clear cut, let's say.
Yeah, I worked once for a senior executive, and he asked me, he joined later than me, and he asked me, okay, I've been here for a month, what's the business strategy of the company?
Yeah.
And I was like, dude, I've been trying to figure it out since the last 6 months. And I was kind of hoping that you are gonna be able to tell me that, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So even at that level, sometimes
Yeah.
it's very, very hard to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
So that's why transparency is all encompassing
Yeah.
thing where you just put it out there, everything, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned
But
roles and
it's
responsibilities, promotion, growth, everything.
yeah. But it's I mean it's a really great point that you make there that even at that level, you're kind of almost too embarrassed to ask. That you're like, I
Yes.
should know this. I should have this answer already. And maybe it's giving people the permission to simply say, I don't know. You know, if you're listening today and you're questioning, like, am I really clear on what the expectations that the business has for me, that my manager has for me, and if you're not 100% clear, or if you're not 100% clear on how you get to the next level, how you progress in your career, that there's permission to actually ask that question, because there are people at those levels where it's not clear. And if it's not clear at that level, then it becomes even muddier the further you go down in the organization then. So you need to be able to, as a leader, set those really clear expectations.
You're absolutely right, right? And sometimes it's also people don't exactly know what they want. And then, we have this corporate ladder, and
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
only option is
The
like
ladder.
you either grow in the technical ladder or management ladder, right? So
Yeah.
that's like severely limiting people in a box. You have to
Yes, yeah,
fit
yeah.
this definition, right?
Yeah.
So I was made a manager because they told me you have signs of being a leader. Okay,
Okay.
be a
Yeah.
manager, go lead this. So that's how I moved from Switzerland to US to lead a team. They made
Yeah.
me manager of a software team because they saw some leadership potential in me, right? But I had no clue whether I would like to be a manager, or like,
Yeah.
are there other options to
That's
add
the
value, right?
age old dilemma as well, isn't it? You
Yeah,
know?
exactly, right. But now I think what I was really looking for, I've always looked for some kind of meaning in what work I'm doing.
Yeah.
And if my work is not driving that impact in terms of adding value to our customers or society as a done, right? And not being philosophical here, being very, very
Yeah.
practical, even
Yeah. Yeah.
tactical here. I have to know that what the work that I'm doing is positively impacting the bottom line of the company. Otherwise, I might as well, not waste my time here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's no
And it's
point.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
it's amazing. So many people go around the company. You ask, 90,000 people in a 100,000 company. Okay, what's the impact of your work? I guarantee you, they had no clue, no
Yeah.
idea,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So yeah.
Yeah.
So I
But
think
for
I
me, I
think
think it's up to us as individuals to understand that impact, but also as leaders to tell people what that is. Like, you know, from the research I've done, it's so important that leaders make that connection really obvious as to what that person's role, like what contribution that they're making to the wider business's objectives, and
and
the important role that they play.
that brings me to my second point. The
Woohoo.
thing is, you're absolutely right that someone should be doing this. Someone
Yeah.
should be clarifying the roles.
Yeah.
And when you say leaders, I am assuming that you're mentioning like maybe thinking senior leaders, right? Uh, or, like, did you mean senior leaders or?
For me, it comes from the top, but it translates down from the top. And so I would expect that a person managing a team, so a team manager, a team leader, will be able to articulate the they'll know themselves what their contribution and impact on the organization is, but they will be able to articulate for each of their team members what that impact is. Now maybe that gets lost along the way somewhere, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are based on, you know, what you know, whether it's at that level or whether it's at the more senior level.
Yeah, so I think the second pillar that I mentioned was autonomy. And when I say autonomy, it's both individual autonomy. One thing is important is like everyone is different, their needs are different, their personal situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
The way their body is built is different when they want to work. Some people are morning people, some are like night people.
Yeah, yeah.
So autonomy over your work, when you work, where you work, what time you work, how you work, right? That's supremely important. Sometimes it's not always possible, but in tech companies, it's totally possible. There's absolutely no reason to not allow this, right? So,
Yeah.
but I think apart from individual autonomy, I am very, very ardent, even radical supporter of team autonomy, where a team, every member of the team has a very, very big stake in what they're doing. A very, very big stake, and very, very, they said, if they fail, maybe they have negative consequences, but if they succeed, they probably have a very large upside as well.
Yeah.
They figure out who their customers are, what their outcomes are, who is present in the team, who to hire, etc. Because sometimes I've hired people and the approval goes to the C level, C executive, right? Now, what on earth would they know about what kind of person do I need in my team?
And that's the opposite of autonomy. That's
exactly.
bureaucracy. Yeah.
I'm like, why are they approving this person? They have no idea. They have not interviewed. I have interviewed the person. I know what I wrote the job description. There's 5 members of my team who interviewed this person. Why would the C-level guy need, right? And I was like desperate to hire. It's so hard, difficult to hire in Silicon Valley. I was desperate, and it was taking 2 weeks to get the approval, right? So that kind of thing, right? But it's really, really important to have this autonomy over what they're doing, and even having a customer in the middle, right? So the customer is what they're building stuff for, right? And it could be an internal customer or external customer. It doesn't really matter. But as long as every team member knows what outcome is being driven for the customer, I would argue that they would figure out roles and responsibilities much faster than if it was the Soviet style planning. I have worked in some companies where the last 3 months of the year is spent in planning, and come January, nobody looks at the planning document ever after January, right? And I'm just wondering, like, didn't we win war or something like that? It was like way before I born, and then we have cut the head of the communist hydra or whatever, right? But there's this communism or like Soviet style central planning everywhere in our tech companies, where there's like central level planning is happening at the senior leadership level, and then people are just there to execute, right? I actually was in a meeting where a senior leader did like an 8-hour long Zoom meeting. There's like 70 people, I think 30 people in the meeting, 8 hour, and the senior leader was like writing down the tasks in a spreadsheet and assigning names and saying, this person does like 11% of his time does this, and 13% of his time does that, and blah, blah, blah. And there were other managers.
A meeting that could have been an email.
And we were just for 8 hours, we were looking at a spreadsheet.
That's crazy. 8 hours times 30 times what's the average hourly rate? And that's the amount of money in monetary terms. That's what's been wasted during that time.
And absolutely right. And the other point is, the team itself was 70 people, right? There were like 40 other people, supposedly junior software engineer, who are children, who don't have any brains. Well, they have brains to write software code, but they're apparently not adult enough to understand what the company needs or what the business strategy is, and etc. Right? So what we'll do is that we'll not invite them to this Zoom meeting. We'll write their names and we'll hand them down the task after the meeting, right? Because that's why the other managers there for, right? So the senior leader will write down the task and assign the names, and then the managers.
Do that, then he wouldn't have a job.
Right. So this was happening, right? And if you are surprised that people are feeling alienated, they don't feel as if they're part of something, then I have to seriously question your EQ, IQ, or whatever Q.
This is exactly it.
Right.
So and the third element I was going to ask about,
how do we form these communities, right? So once we have the transparencies, then autonomy, the team autonomy, right? Now we are getting somewhere. Now everybody exactly knows what is needed from them. They exactly know what do they want to achieve in their own careers, what drives them, what is their personal mission, how does it align with company's mission, and they choose which projects to work on, right?
Yeah.
And they choose which community or team to join, right? And by the way, this is not, so once you have transparency and autonomy taken care of, then you're starting to bake the foundations of a community.
Mm.
And when I say community, it's really, we mentioned earlier that it has a shared purpose or shared goal, right? But then at a company, you might have these values and behaviors that are needed for all the communities inside. Let's call them micro communities. Just imagine company as a network, not as a hierarchy, but as a network of micro communities.
Yeah.
And then there is a bigger umbrella community, which comprises of everyone in the company, even the customers, suppliers, and everyone else, right? And then essentially the concept of community is that community is not there just to like people hang out, right? Every community is also self-sustaining in the terms of they have to drive some kind of economic impact, right? They have to generate, maybe not directly, but sometimes directly the revenues for the customers. And if the community is not working out, you just disband it and some people join another community, right? And I think in Amazon, they have this concept of single-threaded teams, which comes pretty close to this model, where this team comprises of everyone, designers, engineers, product managers, and everyone in that small unit, and they are self-sustaining, self-sufficient, right? But I think there is a better example. There's this company called Hire. They are appliance maker, and their CEO was fed up with bureaucracy. And what he did was he eliminated 12,000 managerial jobs, 12,000 of that, completely, one stroke of pen, right? Yeah. And instead, they created these micro enterprises. It's very similar to Amazon single-threaded team. Micro enterprises are typically 10 to 15 people who, by the way, find their own colleagues who they are really interested working with, who they share good relationship, who they like, and complementary skills, and so on and so forth, right? They figure out the opportunity, and a micro enterprise is formed. And this micro enterprise, every person is responsible for getting the revenues, right? Even the software engineer, they're not only responsible for writing software. Their job is not done when they write the software and they ship the software and they cannot go home, right? If they're writing software that is not adding value to customers, their job is not done, right? So they are inherently in the sales path, right? So they may have a sales team, but even every software engineer is also selling the solution that they're building. So now what happens is that if you have only one micro enterprise, then it's severely limiting. It's 10 to 15 people cannot achieve much, right? So they had this concept of micro communities where maybe there is a bigger problem to tackle, and a few micro enterprises come together to form these micro communities where they are a bigger organization, if you will, but still the micro enterprise is fully autonomous. Yeah, right? They're deciding, and autonomous in the sense that, just imagine, in big tech companies, there is typically centrally an infrastructure team that is providing, the cloud, private cloud or whatever, right? They're building, and typically these private cloud people who are building this private cloud, they're much slower than what an Amazon Web Services could build, for example, right? Okay. Yeah, but still, everyone else in the company are forced to use this service for internal service from our internal teams, right? Yeah. And they cannot use AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, right? But in the higher model, each micro enterprise will use whatever is needed for them to deliver value to their customers. Yeah. If there is another micro community inside Hire that is building cloud services, if they don't do a good job, this other micro enterprise will go choose Google Cloud or AWS, right? They had this autonomy.
It's in their interest to perform
exactly,
well and
to
do it efficiently. Right? Yeah.
Right. So just imagine, shared goal is not enough, because if you remove the autonomy pillar and then you force them, then everything gets devalued eventually, right? And then they're not doing their job because they are dependent on some other team who are not doing their job well, and things like that, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. So that's why once you have this closely knit team that is adding value to their customers, that's when magic starts to happen, right? And I think I have given some examples in the book where is community-led effort can do wonders, right? And community is not just, hunky-dory thing where you just hang out to discuss your problems and go back home, right? It's not like, I mean, I totally appreciate the employees resource groups that are based on a number of factors, right? It's similar to, like, for example, uh, it is important to have, uh, you know, so-called underrepresented minorities, and having an ERG for them to go speak up the problems, the issues they're facing, right? But I see a problem with that is that, sometimes those can become echo chambers, and this probably is controversial, but their problems are not discussed with a wider company, and it sort of becomes an echo chamber, right? So instead, what I'm talking about is having building some community based on an interest which is beneficial also for the company, right? I'll give you an example. I mentioned a guy called Steve who joined Johnson & Johnson from a startup. He was in a seven people startup, and he joined this behemoth Johnson & Johnson, which has like 100,000 employees, right?
Yeah.
And he was like trying to figure out, okay, how do I do innovation here? And so he soon figured that there are 1,000 VPs here. And if he has some ideas, he has to go pitch it to a VP. And then if he says no, go to another VP, she says no, and so on and so forth. Maybe the 1,000th VP will say yes, right? And that's clearly not efficient way to, to drive innovation, right? And then he said, okay, maybe let's just, like, he met a few instigators like much like himself, and then they started forming a small community. And community is nothing, right? It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a WhatsApp group, right? Or a Slack group. And they're just trying to figure out outside of their work. They're saying, okay, I'm really interested in building a solution to better diagnose depression, for example, right? They're okay figuring out together. People who are interested in this topic, they're coming together, right? But then they've soon figured that they have to be financially, economically viable. Otherwise, the communities will die, wither away, right? And then their key goal was to drive innovation. And there are so many people who have great ideas, but they don't have the patience or energy to go pitch it to 1,000 VPs, right? So they said, okay, how do we garner support, right? How do we spread these brilliant ideas and get support, right? Fortunately, such a mechanism exists in the world. It's called TED, if you have ever seen TED Talks.
Yeah, of course.
Technology, entertainment design, right?
Ideas worth spreading.
Ideas worth spreading. Okay, well, it's they said, okay, let's do a TEDx, TEDx for business. TEDx Johnson was born. TEDx J&J.
Wow.
And they started, I think, with a few people, and within 6 years, their TEDx J&J community was 29,000 people.
Incredible.
Right, and hundreds of TED Talks, right? And not everyone becomes TED speaker. Sometimes they are, someone is delivering a powerful TED Talk. I spoke about someone who was super passionate about curing depression because she had this friend who died or who committed suicide, and they could not figure out how much, at some scale, how depressed was he. Right. So she was really, really passionate about figuring out how to better make these tools for depression. And she had some ideas, she had some insights, and she delivered this very powerful talk. And, she woke up, the talk was, watched live, obviously, but also it was, some people watched it on recorded video. And next day she had like hundreds of emails from scientists, from engineers, from VPs, and everyone who wanted to build that solution. I think it was in 8 months. The talk was delivered somewhere in May or June or something. And by February, the product was already out in the market, right? So it's so powerful. And just imagine, they built something which is obviously super useful for our society, finding able to diagnose depression much more effectively. It is beneficial for Johnson & Johnson, for business, good for business. And it is good for the employees who were involved in building this solution. And they find true purpose, right? And people chose to be part of this community, the community that builds tools for diagnosing depression, right? That is the community, right? And it was not handed down by senior executive leaders. It came organically, right? And I can just bet the sense of belonging in those people part of that community would be like way, way higher than anyone who is handed out the task written on a spreadsheet by their senior leader. Yeah. And this is how you build a community, right? I think I have other examples in the book where, you just sometimes, make people, join these communities, existing communities. I gave an example of a black woman who was from Trinidad and Tobago, and she joined the Black ERG community, but she did not feel connected with the community simply because she did not share the experiences of the Black Americans. She came from the Caribbean, much different history, right? And just she just did not feel connected, right? And then she started this community, which to improve the data science in the company. And she was a PhD in statistics, right? And instead of calling her a doctor in philosophy and statistics, you call her a Black person, right? People are very, very complex, and they are not easily defined by simple things like ethnicity and their skin color, right? So as much, again, this is controversial, as much as there are race issues for sure, I would never discount it, but I don't touch about that in my book because I don't have any experience. I have not lived those experiences. I'm not a researcher in this, right? I talk only about work, right? But in context of work, people have much more to them, to their personality, to their values, to their purpose, than just their skin color or their language or background, right? And in this case, if I say statistics, it is, again, she made a community, and this community was, I think, grew to 4,000 people. You can imagine these people, 4,000 people, teaching each other new tools for data science, building tools, building products based on data science. Similarly, the other companies like Intuit, who focus very heavily on design. Design is core to their company's values. They have community teaching people. Every single person who joins Intuit, they learn about how to design well. Like what is the design sense of a community, right? So companies can use communities for everything from driving innovation to building new products to living their values as a company, mission, everything, right? And that is sorely missing. And it wouldn't really matter whether people are working remotely or they're in person. I mean, having this kind of community is much more powerful and effective than doing this virtual happy hours every Friday, which I hate, by the way.
And there's the last one then in this sense of creating belonging. Did you want to touch on that before we wrap things up?
Yes. So now I think we did not touch upon the fourth pillar, which is technology. And technology is simply a way to do things at scale. In my last 2 years, when I was working remotely with COVID, I think the only tool that people were using was Zoom, and there was frankly zero investment in other kind of technology solutions that are available. That are available, right? So I mentioned, I give a lot of examples of tools that are super useful to people to work like way more effectively in remote setting, right? But anyways, right? So now the concept of belonging at a very high level, belonging is finding your place in a group, right? Feeling valued, having some kind of meaning in what work you do, being valued, being seen, heard, right? And having good relationship with others, right? Growing with others, teaching someone, learning from someone, just having a good time, fun time with each other, right? That is simple, right? That is the root of belonging. You shouldn't feel out of place, in other words, right? You go, you join a company, and no one cares who you are, what you do, and you have no idea, and you just, people say you are vesting in peace. It's a term where your stock options are vesting for 2 years and they're just coasting along, right? So that is completely opposite of belonging, right? So you should find your place, right? And to create this belonging, there's no button or click that you can click, or you turn on a button and then the belonging is created. Belonging is created when you organize the company, the values and the behaviors which are inherently aligned and attuned to the human needs of digital that I mentioned, right? And the way to create the belonging is to enable fostering these communities. Imagine a lot of communities are forming and dying. When the community's purpose is fulfilled, they can just die. No point in like holding on to community just for the sake of it, right? So if you create conditions where these communities can form organically, and people are empowered to form these communities, people are empowered to do their best work through these communities, they're like with autonomy and with full transparency of what everyone else is doing, that's when you will start to see this sense of belonging in people, right? Otherwise you cannot mandate the sense of belonging with people as a senior leader. You have to create these conditions. And for that, you have to structure different things differently. When you exercise this sense of control over things that cannot be inherently controlled, then you will erode this sense of belonging in people. That's what we have been doing for very long, unfortunately.
That we're trying to control the uncontrollable, essentially. Now, I realize that we're kind of coming up towards the end of the podcast, and this is maybe a philosophical question and may open a can of worms that warrants an entire new podcast episode. But I am curious about this, what you're calling about feeling like you when you don't belong somewhere versus when you do belong somewhere, because I've experienced both. And for me, if I get a sense that I don't belong, whether that's on a personal level with a group of people or with an individual, I tend to just walk away rather than kind of trying harder, if you like. So, I suppose it's about finding, and I'm kind of thinking to what Brené Brown talks about and vulnerability and all of these kind of things. I think there are some places that you belong, but there's some places that you don't, because those people are not your people. They're not your tribe. They don't have similar values to you. They don't behave in the way that you're used to behaving or that you would expect people to behave. Any thoughts on that sense of belonging and not really fitting in, and what sort of drives that, and is it okay to walk away?
I did walk away myself. I think it's all right to walk away, because the cost of not doing so is immense. And for example, if you go hit someone, you punch someone, you can see the blood pouring out of the nose, right? So physical injuries are easy to see, but mental scars are invisible, right? And it is, I would say it's probably not even known the extent of the mental or psychological damage feeling a sense of unbelonging can do to people, right? I think it's absolutely okay to walk away. And you cannot really control the behavior of other people, right? You can only control your own behavior, your own values, right? And I think I'm a firm believer that a toxic behavior spreads like a virus, but so does good behavior.
Yes.
Right. So you are while you are at a place where you don't feel you belong, you can still choose to behave in the most best possible manner, right? And then it's easy to walk away, right? And I think in my own way, I no longer care about my own individual success, because I've realized that the only way that I grow and feel satisfaction is if I grow with other people. And it's super important for me to be part of a group that cares about each other's growth rather than their own individual success.
Yes. Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. Now, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does happier at work mean to you?
That's a great question. That's how I started writing this book, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But
so it's really contained in the entire episode is what it means to you.
Yeah. So I think I now have a slightly better understanding of what I would like to see in work, what would make me happy. First of all, what I don't want is pressure on me to have promotions. I don't want any promotions. I don't care. I want to grow as a human. I want to gain skills, but I also want to do impactful work. And I realize that I can do great work on my own, but my effectiveness and even the quality of my work grows tenfold if I am working with other people. This has been a pattern, right? I was a mediocre student way back, when I was 10-year-old. I turned into a very exceptional student just because I was hanging out with other friends who were exceptional students themselves.
Okay,
right?
yeah. It's who you surround yourself with and all that.
Exactly. So I know the power of this growth fostering relationship where people learn from each other, and it has got nothing to do with what IQ you have, right? You put me in isolation, I would be an entirely stupid person. But I thrive when I'm in a group of smart folks who are much smarter than myself, right? I think a lot of people talk about this, but what makes me happy at work is if I'm in growth fostering relationship with amazing set of folks who deeply care about the work that they're doing, creating impact together, growing together, finding meaning together. I do not want to be working alone. As long as I'm in good relationship with other people and growing, I'll be super happy at work.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Brilliant. Love that. And if people want to reach out, if they want to find out more about the book, if they want to connect with you, what's the best way that they can do that?
I am super active on LinkedIn, so you can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Yogesh K. Soni. You can also reach out to me at my website, yogeshksoni.com. You can also email me, yksoni@yogeshksoni.com. I think those are the three ways to reach me. I normally respond to my emails pretty quickly. I have this habit of clearing my inbox, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
not
Inbox
super
zero.
great habit. Yeah, inbox zero. I'm getting over it, but I'm pretty quick to respond to emails.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Great. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure. And I'm so glad we were able to finally to record this podcast episode. So I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
thank you, Aoife, for having me on this show. I would love to come back on your show. Love to collaborate on other stuff as well, because I think we are very closely aligned in our personal mission.
Definitely.
You want to see happy people. You are like it's. I'm happy just to be on your show, right? You
Thank
have this
you.
big smile, and it's so heartwarming to be on your show. I
Thanks
absolutely
so
loved it.
much.